Hello everyone, this is Vincent Slomers and Patrick Sheafer. We are doing our topic on, as you see, fantasy esports. What we will be discussing is fantasy esports. We will also talk about fantasy sports and what the current issue and climate is like regarding that. So to begin, we will discuss what fantasy sports is, since most of you might have an idea of what fantasy sports is rather than fantasy esports. So as you can see, I have fantasy sports are where a fan of the game can kind of draft, they can drop, they can sign, they can add their own real players to their own virtual roster. And how this works is based on the individual athlete's performance. The fan who had drafted the roster gets points based on if they do well, or if, let's say for football, they score a touchdown, they get points based off that. And at the end of the week, or at the end of the season, whoever has the most points wins. So that's fantasy sports in a nutshell. You get points based off of the performance of the athletes that you drafted at the beginning of the season. This can be organized on apps such as DraftKings or other fantasy sports apps, and it can be with your friends, or if you just want to do it just to do it, you can do it with random people online. So fantasy esports is very similar to fantasy sports. It's similar in that instead of drafting football or baseball athletes, you're drafting professional esports athletes who are also part of their own teams. It works the same, just as if a fantasy esport athlete does well, then if you had drafted them, you get points based off their performance. One of the major differences between fantasy sports and fantasy esports is that fantasy esports are usually just for like a weekend, since there are no real seasons in fantasy esports. It's more just tournaments that will last a weekend. To go over the current issue with fantasy esports. So since the performance of an individual player is what gets points, the likelihood for cheating and fixing is higher. So if just an individual's performance is the difference between making a lot of points and not having a lot of points, then that could motivate the individual as themselves to cheat or fix games. With other kinds of sports betting, it goes based off of an entire team, and it's harder to get an entire team to cheat and sway an entire team's performance rather than just an individual's. And as the second bullet point, it's just yet another form of gambling. I have there, it says the illusion of skill, and what I mean by that is fantasy sports and fantasy esports fans and players, the people who draft their own lineups, they have the illusion of skill because they put a lot of research into who to draft and who to sign onto their team. So that's where the quote-unquote skill comes in curating your own lineup. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is still all up to chance and luck. Our references. Thank you for your time.